Chapter 16. You and Yours. It was the end of the day, their second since moving deeper into Kerith. The sun was just stretching its rays along the tips of the tents when the war horns began to blow from the eastern flank. A cloud of dust hung in the air, followed by billowing smoke. Men rose from beside the cooking fires, and the clatter of arms sounded within the camp. In the king's circle of tents, squires hurried to help their masters buckle armor and tack their horses. Gail had Barnaby ready in short order, as she kept his saddle and bridle close and always ready. The king himself, in shining mail and a glittering half-helm, rallied the knights and nobles of the high houses. As Derred mounted Barnaby and Gail handed him his sword, Sergeant Callum came running past.
"Sergeant, what news?"
Derred called out. Red-faced, sweat wringing beneath his arms, Callum panted.
"Morvant raiding party killed a few men and set fire to some tents. They have been repelled. They're already riding back from whence they came. They must have seen our numbers and grown afraid."
Already the king with his cavalry was riding down the central thoroughfare, the royal compound emptying as warriors, idle too long, leapt to join the fight. "My lord," Gail said, nearly swallowing her words, "might I be so bold as to offer counsel?"
"It is welcome,"
Derred said with a narrowing of his eyes, Barnaby stomping his hooves beneath him. "Might you call the king back?" Callum, who had remained close by and overheard, snorted.
"You forget yourself, horseboy."
"Let him speak," Derred said, raising his hand. "We are surrounded by buttes and box canyons. I know because the squires and I scouted them yesterday. Perfect ground for an ambush. The Morvant have kept their attacks small and their numbers hidden by design. They now make an attack with the setting sun in their eyes and follow with a swift retreat. I reckon it's a feint to draw out our cavalry."
"You mean to say that they plan to attack the body of the camp?"
She shook her head. "Twilight is not the time to start an attack of armies afield. It's more in keeping with their methods to try to wound the body by attacking the head."
"The king?"
She nodded.
"How can you be so sure?"
Derred asked. Because it was what she would have done as Avenger Red. But there was no percentage in that argument for her now. Her mind raced to invent a rationale. A night in the caves on the edge of her father's territory came to mind. She saw raindrops chaining in puddles, cedar boughs dancing in the wind, and smoke curling from a fire. And she remembered that mercenary Cody had told stories from the Islay War. "My father fought in the Islay War, on the losing side. They were often against overwhelming numbers, but had the advantage of fighting with the indigenous people, who knew the territory better than the invaders. These are tactics they would have used," Gail said.
"If the king is in danger, more than he realizes, I must be at his side. For this is Kerith, and I know these lands better than most in his party."
Derred pulled on Barnaby's reins, steadying him.
"Do you want me to teach a lesson to this squire, Captain? Teach him his place?"
Callum asked.
"No, Sergeant. I will proceed to the king's side."
"I caution you, sir. It is a trap," Gail said.
"Alex, armies run on order, even if you and yours don't. Gods be with us."
He kicked Barnaby and was gone. Gail was left staring at the fire pit. So lost in thought was she that she did not notice Callum step up alongside her until he had taken her by the collar and dragged her into the tent. The table fell over as he threw her into the interior.
"About time you learned the order of things around here, runt."
Before she could pull herself upright, he planted a kick into her gut that sent her reeling and lit the corners of her vision with spots of color. There was no fighting back. If there was any time she loathed her lot in life, her freakish smallness, it was now. Without weapons, she had no advantage. She curled into herself, trying to protect her head from the blows that kept coming, each sending shards of pain through her body. Callum was breathing through his teeth, leaning on the leg of the overturned table while he stomped on her. Her entire world was reduced to the shocks of pain and the intervals in between. Time was fluid, malleable, seconds dragging out like eternities. Nothing existed except the knowledge it might not end, and that, in truth, she deserved every blow. The faces of so many children, forced into labor, torn from their families, tortured, killed even, flashed in her mind, each one accusing her. She was guilty, not for the insubordination Callum accused her of, but things so much worse. Callum lifted her up by the hair and stretched her neck back. His face was close to hers, the cut sewn shut on his cheek, bending like a second, scowling mouth. She recognized the same feeling of insight into herself and her life that she had experienced in the fountain. Somehow, it allowed her to surrender, to prepare for the worst. This was the beating she had been earning her entire life. "Do your worst," she heard herself say. Tears streaked down her face, but not tears of fear as Callum surely thought. Tears of release. For only in this suffering, and the inevitable end she sensed coming, would the scales ever be tipped right. The journey that had begun in the font was coming to an end. He cocked his head sideways before a grin exposed his teeth. "Who do you think?" But he never finished his rejoinder. His head snapped forward with a loud thud, and his body fell limp and heavy across her. No sooner had his weight pressed down on her than it was rolled away. She looked up to see Patrick looking down at her, Kevin behind him, one of the logs from the unlit fire outside in his hands.
"Alex, are you all right?"
She spat a gob of red blood and felt one of her teeth had gone missing. "Just desserts," she said.
"What are you talking about?"
Patrick asked. What was she talking about? For the things she had done, she had deserved to die, not to be saved.
"Why was he beating you?"
"A lifetime of wrongs." Patrick and Kevin glanced at one another. Her mind was still stuck on justice. Surely if she was still breathing, it had not been measured out completely. But maybe there was reason in it. There was something she and only she could do. The clue lay in Darred's words before he left. "Order," she said, rolling onto her side, then into a sitting position, her head throbbing. "Callum did not like it that I didn't respect the order of things. Armies run on it."
"That is no reason to beat you,"
Patrick said. "I deserve it more than you know," she said, looking up into his eyes and spitting again. She pulled herself up by the same table leg that Callum had leaned upon. "The king is riding into a trap. We've got to help him."
"How do you know?"
Kevin asked, letting the log drop to the floor. "Call it an informed hunch. I tried to explain it to Darred and Callum, but the truth did not work."
"So what do we do?"
"Lie, of course." She turned to the armory chest, opened it, and drew out her bow and quiver. She slid on her baldric and both swords. The daggers she had planned to trade she shoved under her belt.
"Lie to whom? What are you saying?"
Patrick asked. "The other squires. If I'm wrong, the foot soldiers need to stay here to repel any further attacks. They're too slow anyway. The squires, they each have horses, though." She smiled to herself, knowing she was taking a page from King Talamar's book. "Tell them the king ordered for them to follow. They will be more than happy to prove themselves."
"But who is here with the authority to order them?"
"Nobody but us, and that means there is nobody to stop us."
"But did the king really order this?"
Patrick looked confused. She met them both in a wordless stare.
"Don't answer him,"
Kevin said.
"We won't question, but you better be right."
"I hope I am." Chapter 17. Under the Elven Lantern Light. Sandalin showed no surprise to find Haille and the elk crossing the lawn towards his home when they returned. Haille was glad his excursion was not poorly received. The others had wandered outside as well. Cody reclined in a hammock slung between trees, while Val sat under an apple tree, sharpening his sword with a whetstone. Haille took his turn to sleep the rest of the morning in the sun. Maylie served a lunch of sweet cakes and a potato stew. By mid-afternoon, Haille had started a game of tag with Gavin and Roslyn, chasing them through the slanting sunlight amid clouds of butterflies. For a while after, they engaged in a game of tossing and smacking pine cones about with sticks. Then, tired, Gavin suggested they play a game of carousel. The elflings settled on the lawn by a playing board with figurines set on either end. The board itself was incised with 2 overlapping circles, crosshatched by a grid of lines. Gavin and Rosalind moved figures and rolled a set of dice in patterns too arcane for Haille to understand. What he did grasp was the artistry of the figures. There were 8 to a side. Gavin's were armored and cloaked in a variety of colors. One in a red cloak and blue half-plate armor with golden hair caught Haille's attention. The detail on the warrioress was so fine, he could sense a similarity between this figure and the striking woman on the relief wall in the plaza where they had broken their fast. She was unmistakable, with piercing green eyes staring out from a face that was a mask of smooth ivory. "Gavin, who is this supposed to be?" Haille asked. The elfling propped his head up on the heel of one hand and took the figure up in the other. "This is Arryn Hintland, greatest of the Vespar." The metal of her miniature sword held at guard across her body flashed in the sunlight. "She defeated the Kryen and trapped them in the Seal of Dormain." "The Seal of what?" "Not all of them," Rosalind piped up, plucking a figure from her side. Her figures were uniformly dark, arrayed in grays and charcoal robes, but one stood out among them for her head of wavy auburn hair. "She didn't defeat Rachmar. She's my favorite." "She can't be your favorite. She is a Kryen," Gavin insisted. "She is my favorite of the Kryen." Haille took a closer look at the figure in question, equally detailed and equally beautiful, except for one flaw. The eyes appeared to be mismatched in color, one green and the other blue. Haille didn't know such exquisite craftsmanship was possible. "And just because Rachmar was not trapped does not mean she was not defeated." Gavin crossed his arms and stared at his sister. "No one knows what happened when she dueled Arryn Hintland," Rosalind said. Gavin twisted his mouth, then smiled. "No, but they will know I beat you." He moved a piece on the board and swept up another one of her Kryen figures, a handsome but stern-looking older man. Haille noticed a name stenciled onto the base that read, Yervon Ashland. Rosalind made a face as if she were sucking a lemon, then went quiet, focused on the game once more. Haille watched the rest of the match and the next, Gavin taking his sister in the first, but Rosalind rallied to win the second, after which Gavin picked up the set and stomped off back to the house. "He doesn't like to lose, especially to me," Rosalind said. Katlyn woke in the late afternoon. By then the sun had retreated behind the treetops and the air had grown cool. Haille and the others had moved inside to drink tea while sitting close to the iron stove that warmed the kitchen. Now father and son played a silent game of carousel, and Rosalind, upon seeing Katlyn appear in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, leapt from her seat and offered to plait Katlyn's hair. Katlyn accepted, rubbing her eyes while Haille poured her a cup of tea. The last time Haille had felt such warmth and easy camaraderie had been the supper he had shared with Katlyn's family upon their return from the font of Jasmine. As easy and comfortable as both gatherings had been, there was a pit in his stomach, a shard of pain that twisted whenever he looked at Gavin and his father, or even Rosalind and her mother. It was a growing sense of the void in him, where memories of such family fellowship should have been. He excused himself to his room, closing the door behind him. He did not make it as far as the bed, but instead caught himself against the wall and slid down to the floor, staring, unable to place his thoughts, much less words, to the gulf he felt within. He had pushed forward over so many weeks, so many leagues, the momentum occupying his will, his waking thoughts. But now anxiety threatened all his assumptions. What was he chasing? What would reaching his father accomplish? The threat of loss had compelled him, But what if the loss was already complete? What if there was nothing to save? His father had already rejected him, and when Haille had the chance to fix himself, he had chosen otherwise. He did not regret the choice at all. Would his father? But if his father would not accept him, his choices, his friends, then what was worth saving? He was relieved when Val knocked on the door and called him back to the kitchen, if for no other reason than to save him from his own thoughts. Haille opened the door.
Sandalin wants to talk to us,
Val said. I'm coming, Haille said, pinching the bridge of his nose.
Not looking like that,
Val said. He dropped his hand from where it had been rubbing the scar on his chin and pushed Haille backwards into his room, then closed the door behind him. The room felt smaller with Val's imposing figure filling the doorway. He crossed his arms, his feet set apart, and looked at Haille out of the corner of his squinted eye. After making some sort of silent assessment of Haille, Val sighed and sat down on the floor, his knees popping.
I thought Sandalin can wait.
Haille balled his hands and bit his lip, Val leveling a wordless stare at him.
Well,
the captain finally said.
What? You going to tell me what is wrong?
I don't want to talk about it, Haille heard himself say. Val let out his breath and made a tisking noise.
Normally, I would leave another man alone with his thoughts, his demons.
Haille swallowed and looked to the door. Val continued.
But times are not normal, and neither are you.
Normal is exactly what I wish I were.
But you are not, Prince Haille. You are a leader.
Haille snorted. I have a title. That does not make one a leader.
I'll be the first to agree. Even command does not make one a leader, nor does doing things right.
Now Haille was confused. Val read it in his face, and a bemused smile crept into the corner of his mouth.
It's not doing things right that make a leader. It's doing the right things. You've bungled some choices, sure, but all in all, Haille, you've made some good choices. Choices that the others believe in. Choices I believe in. And so we follow you. Your vision. Your dream.
But what if that dream is a fallacy, Val?
Saving the king?
Haille returned to his own spot, sitting on the floor.
Val, I guess it was never just about saving him. It's about redeeming me. That is plain to us all.
Haille felt a flash of relief, but it was soon gone. But what if he still does not care?
Then he is a fool.
Haille felt as if slapped. He looked up into Val's face. His expression was steel, steadfast. To his surprise, Haille felt a laugh building in him.
Just like that, you would dismiss him. He would deserve it, even if he has the title king.
Haille laughed again.
It feels good, doesn't it?
Val said.
Yes,
Haille said, not exactly sure why.
Good. Don't lose hope about reconciliation. Fathers and sons, they are tricky things. But as long as you both live, there is hope to improve things between you. Be grateful for that. Now, master yourself. I said you are a leader. The others look to you. There will come a time, I believe, when many will follow you. You need to learn to wear a countenance of courage.
Even when I'm feeling afraid. Val got up and turned to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob.
That is the only time you really get to be brave.
Once they had returned to the kitchen, Sandalin announced that the elders would be holding a banquet in their honor.
And much would be at stake,
Val pointed out, draining the dregs of his tea.
Both of you must be at your best tonight. These elders are the ones presumably to make the decision to help us or not.
Haille's stomach felt light and queasy, as if full of feathers. He was all too aware that it was his ancestor who had persecuted and betrayed these elves.
Do you think they even want to see me, considering whom I am related to?
Of course, Sandalin said, looking up from the game of Carousel and taking one of Gavin's pieces in the process.
After all, you helped rescue Veolin Crossborn.
Do you think she will be there? Haille asked.
She might,
Sandalin said, frowning as Gavin took one of his pieces.
But I know she must take time to heal. She has not been seen much about.
Haille stared out the window, his spirits flattening. More tea? Mayleaf asked. Sure, thank you. Gavin and Roslyn were to remain behind, but Sandalin and Mayleaf were transformed for the banquet. Gone was Mayleaf's apron, replaced by a silver gown that reminded Haille of a waterfall, the way its folds rippled and fell. Like so many of the things crafted by the elves, Haille wondered if there was some subtle magic charm woven into it. Sandalin wore a jacket that reached his knees. He had an older one which he let Haille borrow, even though it showed no signs of wear and tear. Quite the opposite. Its threadwork was sturdy and fine. Fitting Val and Cody was more difficult, for their shoulders and chests were larger than the figures of the slender elves, but Sandalin found colorful sashes for them to wear that gave their traveling clothes an air of festive formality. Haille particularly noticed Katlyn's new appearance. One of Mayleaf's gowns fit her as if it had been tailored for her shape. Roslyn's arrangement of her hair into braids and loops was unlike anything Haille had ever seen in Antis, but it suited Katlyn well. She looked more splendid than any noble woman at court.
Well, I never,
Cody said, looking up from adjusting his sash. The gown was off the shoulder and left her arms bare, allowing the dragon-binding band to show. Katlyn cupped her hand under it. Is it appropriate to show it here?
It is not forbidden. It will attract attention, though, Mayleaf said. But you may want to show it to some of the elders. It is a fascinating piece, Sandalin said.
I'll take any opportunity to see if I can learn more about it, Katlyn said.
Here,
Mayleaf said, wrapping a gossamer lavender shawl around her.
This will allow you to cover it and reveal it as you wish.
Katlyn thanked her. The shawl made the ensemble complete, and Haille exchanged sheepish looks with the other men, imagining that they all felt a bit drab in comparison.
They will think you a princess and us part of your retinue.
Val, she laughed, then changed her expression to one of worry. Haille, do you think it is too much? I don't mean to seem out of place.
Tonight, I don't mind sharing the attention whatsoever.
Indeed, Katlyn was the center of attention. The banquet was held in a hall that felt neither inside nor out. It was a clearing, its borders marked by more channels of running water and trunks of great trees, these polished to a dark red sheen. Their branches interlocked overhead in a dense ceiling of sorts, but starlight still peeked through the irregular-shaped gaps. The rest of the space was lit by torches that glowed not with the red-orange light of flame, but rather a soft blue that cast all the elves in an ethereal glow. It favored their light skin tone and their glimmering clothes, lending them all a magical quality. Aside from these differences, and of course differences in the food, everything was sweet and the bread was light, Haille was struck by how similar the banquet was to the goings-on at the court where he had grown up. There were 24 elder elves recognizable by their age and bearing. They were attended to by a small army of helpers. Seraphina and Gandalin made sure to introduce Haille and his friends to all of them, making a circuit of the room that Haille found as dreary as it was familiar, entertaining small talk, showing deference to those who obviously felt that they were deserving it. At one point, between introductions, Seraphina sidled up beside him and whispered, "You have been trained well in the ways of court." "Thank you," Haille said. But this was, in truth, easier than the events in the castle. There he was looked upon with disdain. Here disdain was replaced with curiosity. He sensed some suspicion, especially when his last name, Hillbourne, was mentioned, but most of the elders expressed gratitude that they had saved Veolin more than anything else. And the elves themselves were more interesting than the self-important lords and ladies of Antis. Even if he could not catch all of their unusual names, Tanith, Bandolin, Marilyn, Asphodel, and others he had never heard before, their fair faces stood out in his memory. But, ultimately, it was Katlyn who consumed much of their attention. To her credit, she was beautiful and elegant, and she had also proved herself a fighter in their efforts to thwart the Vorgs. What she did not know of formality, she made up for with a sense of self-possession and humility. "You look half-elf yourself," one elf in a red crushed velvet doublet said to her. Sandalin suggested Katlyn show her binding band to the oldest of the elders, a hunched, whitened elf with deep smile lines and a cerulean cloak. His roomy eyes widened at the sight of it, and he raised his eyebrows when she explained it had been on her arm since she had appeared on her adopted family's doorstep in a basket. She shared how it seemed to grow with her, always fitting the circumference of her arm, but never so big that she could slide it past her elbow. In the gleam of the silver lanterns, the band glowed and sparkled so much that Haille fancied that he could imagine the dragon incised on it dancing and swaying with her movements. The old elf looked close, but stopped short of touching the band.
"Powerful magic and great craftsmanship. I have never seen its like."
Katlyn's face darkened with sadness when he said that he could not tell her more. But he did promise to take a second look, a deeper one, at a more opportune time. Shortly after, they were called to the table to eat the main course. After such a flurry of introductions, Haille was disappointed not to have met Veolin again. However, Adamantus approached their seats with 2 elves following behind. The other elves seated around the table nodded to them in greeting and followed them with their eyes. They both were tall, one with long blonde hair, the other brown with light brows and flowing script tattooed onto his neck, wrists, and anywhere else where his skin was visible. Their features were familiar, and although they did not have the age of the elders, they walked with a sense of purpose that Haille associated with power. He rose as they approached.
"Prince Haille, may I introduce Kaelif and Lazalorn?"
the elk said, nodding to the blonde one and the tattooed one in turn.
"These are the brothers of Veolin Crossborn."
They did not smile. Haille noticed both were armed with swords, daggers, and other blades of strange design. Nor were they dressed in the formal gowns of the others, but rather riding breeches and boiled leather vests and arm pads. These were elves of riding, ranging, and fighting, not unlike their sister.
"We thank you for your service and bravery,"
Kaelif said with a shallow bow. Lazalorn followed with a nod. Both elves' expressions were flat and serious. Despite their sobriety, Haille liked them, if anything else for their lack of pretense and their dress. Here were elves just returned or about to travel. An urgency to return to their own journey kindled within him. Val moved in between them.
"Your sister fought valiantly," he said. "As we would expect her to,"
Kaelif replied. After an uncomfortable pause, Sandalin added that the brothers would dedicate a toast to Haille and his companions, even though they did not seem the toasting type. "Will Veolin be joining us?" Katlyn asked. Haille could have hugged her, for the question was top of his own mind.
"She is indisposed,"
Kaelif said. Apparently he did the speaking for both of the brothers.
"She is resting, convalescing from her wound." "Of course,"
Adamantus said,
"as to be expected after such an ordeal."
Another silence passed before Sandalin broke in with a few tired bromides that allowed them all to comfortably return to their places. "A bit humorless, aren't they?" Katlyn whispered to him.
"But their gratefulness is real,"
Haille said. "As are their good looks," Katlyn added. Haille looked askance at her, but she simply gave a gentle shrug. The brothers indeed showed their gratefulness again in a toast. At least, Kaelif did, displaying a bit more emotion than before. Lazalorn remained silent, but raised his glass in earnest.
"A long time since humans have come to our home, but despite the past, my sibling and I can attest that the union of our people can at times be rich and rewarding."
The toast was followed by applause, a few more speeches, and then Val took the floor as their captain to give thanks for their hospitality and offer humble comments of his own, praising Veolin's fighting spirit. The atmosphere was more relaxed after that, perhaps helped by the white wine that the elves passed around in sparkling carafes. Haille, sensing that his part was nearly over, leaned back in his chair, slightly bored, sleep creeping up on him. Katlyn was engaged in a lively discussion with the roomy old elf again about her binding band. Val, Gandolin, and Adamantus spoke in close proximity to one another at the corner of the table, while Cody performed sleight-of-hand tricks for the elves. They laughed, and one shouted,
"And you insist you are not using magic?"
"No," Cody said. "I'm just an ordinary man forced to thieve by circumstances on occasion." Haille could not help smiling, but he had no one to share his amusement with. He sighed and let his eyes unfocus across the table. That was when he saw her, those orbs of blue over a white bandage, her hair loose and flowing over her shoulders, so dark it appeared to shield her face like a hood. Veolin was standing in the darkness between two trees, but not so far back that the light of the torches did not touch her hand when she made a motion to Haille that was unmistakable. "Follow me." Chapter 18. The Ride of the Squires. The squires proved easy to cajole into saddling their own horses and riding in as reinforcements. They were all too eager for the opportunity to prove themselves and come to the aid of their king, beating their shields and calling out war cries, some with voices that still cracked with youth. Gail had ridden with young warriors before, but often they were hardened, hand-selected by her for cruelty and lack of conscience. How these boys would hold up in the horrors of battle, she was less sure. Soft, she thought most of them, and pampered from city life. All that was about to change, if she was right. If not, it would be the pillory post for her, or even the gallows. Gail had around 4 dozen riders, no time for an exact count. She kept Kevin and Patrick at the front with her. Her 2 friends had shared the orders from the king, so most of the impressionable squires assumed that Kevin and Patrick had been left in charge. It suited her needs. Kevin and Patrick were well-liked, well-respected, and proficient in relaying her orders, calling them out with the deep voice that she lacked. They rode out of the camp following the hoof prints of the cavalry in the sandy soil of the steeps. It made for easy tracking, but she did not like what she saw. The Morvant had retreated into a narrow gorge, a dry riverbed making for swift passage. Too swift. She urged her horse onward to where the canyon walls narrowed, then pulled up hard on the reins, the other riders coming to a stop behind her. The way was blocked. A pile of rock fall, 3 men deep, barred the way. The landslide was fresh. Dust still hung in the air, and rocks were still settling in place. From the other side, she could hear the sounds of war horns, the cries of men, and the clash of arms. "There is nothing natural about this rock slide. It was to cut off their escape."
"Do we climb over?"
Kevin asked. "No. We'd have to leave our horses, and we don't want to surrender that advantage. Ride back. Half to take the north side of the canyon, half the south. We'll ride along the rim and use the high ground to our advantage." She did not wait for comment or even agreement. She simply kicked her own horse, parted the cadre of squires behind her, and hoped they were not too late. There was no relief for her mount. She drove him hard through the scrub and shifting rocks along the dry wadi, briars and branches whipping her legs. Soot croaked and flapped his wings overhead. Half the riders peeled away to the north, where the slope of the canyon wall was gentle, and they started climbing in a cloud of dust. How few they seemed once divided. Their way on the south slope of the canyon was not as easy, the horses floundering on the scree. From halfway up, however, she had a better vantage point on the rim of the canyon to the east. There the cliffs were bristling with Morvant archers, knocking back their arrows, their shadows long in the setting sun. They were dressed like barbarians in skins and leather, not a shining plate of metal armor among them. Their faces were covered in chalky white paint, streaked with lines of red, black, ochre, or blue. It was one thing to hear about the enemy, to build him up in one's mind, but to see him on the field of battle was to make the conflict and the coming violence real. Gail felt bile rising in her throat, her hands trembling with the fever of the fight. They would be spotted any second and lose the element of surprise. Worse, their opponents had the high ground. They could not afford to continue struggling with the horses. "Dismount!" she cried. "Take the rest of the hill on foot." A few squires stubbornly tried to make the rest of the climb mounted, only to have one of the horses tumble with a whinny and crush the leg of the rider. One down already. The others took to running up the slope, most passing her with their longer strides. But when they reached the top, they showed their inexperience, hesitating, gathering around Patrick, who simply looked back to her for instruction. She knew they were past the point of strategy. Already she could see the other half of their party riding down the archers on the north rim. Those on the south rim had already spotted them. "What are you waiting for? Charge them!" The squires were nothing if not brave. Once the order was given, they brandished their swords and went running pell-mell towards the archers. She followed, her stature denying her the opportunity to lead at the front, but she knew Patrick would be there and would rise to the occasion. From atop the rim, she was afforded a clear view of the canyon floor. King Telemar and his men were surrounded, their shields thick with arrows, while Morvant riders circled. Desperate, she found herself searching the purple and blues of the Anton cavalry for the verdant green of Darred's surcoat. She breathed such a sigh of relief at seeing him alive lined up next to the king that she surprised herself. A wave of protectiveness surged within her, along with rage towards the enemy. She drew out an arrow, knocked it back in her bow, steadied herself, and let it fly at a Morvant archer. He twisted as the arrow struck home in his neck, just as one of the squires came and cut him down from behind. She grabbed a second arrow, and a third, picking her targets out from the Morvant that were not engaged yet with the squires. Without plate armor, they made for ripe targets. Her biggest constraint was avoiding her own men. A Morvant tribesman, flakes of white paint in his long mustache, spotted her and came rushing, a stone battle-axe raised above his head. No time to knock an arrow, she drew both her swords, tucked and rolled beneath his strike, spun up, hamstrung him with a quick swing, then lowered her second blade to his neck. She could see his pulse beating in his throat, sweat smearing the paint on the edge of his jaw. His eyes betrayed his fear, his knowledge that he was lost, but so close, as close as she had been to so many other men she had murdered. She lost her desire to release his lifeblood into the dirt. Instead, she kicked away his axe and indicated with a shake of her head for him to run. He wasted no time, scrambling up, turning and sprinting away, kicking up dirt with each running footstep. She was a mystery to herself now, surprised at the waning of her own bloodlust. But there would be others she could not spare. She sheathed her swords and took a knee beside the edge of the cliff, taking aim at the Morvant riders below. The turnabout on the cliffs above had caught them by surprise, and their ring of riders had scattered in panic when arrows began to rain down on them from both the north and south walls. "Don't hit our people!" Gail cried out, as a slew of arrows from squires with little experience stuck into the earth near their own cavalry. She let one arrow after another loose until her fingers peeled and ached. The tide was turning below with the king and his men, breaking out of the dome of shields they had formed, and now striking down the Morvant riders. The Morvant, sensing their own plan turned against them, charged the Antons, making a courageous last stand, though some fled along the dry riverbed, and still others fell to their knees to surrender. Gail pulled arrows from the dead Morvant around her and used them again. Before, she might not have spared those Morvant who surrendered, but this time she did, something like mercy having taken root within her. So she saved her arrows for those who rushed the line of Anton knights, letting the cowards flee and the trusting surrender. When all was done, there were more Morvant covering the ground than their own. Cries of triumph rang out from the canyon. Gail dropped back on her haunches, then her rear, her legs spread out before her, her chin hitting her chest in exhaustion. Patrick slapped her on the back, his face spattered with blood, his grin exultant as he laughed.
"Looks like you just might be a hero, Alex."
Soot settled on her shoulder and croaked as if he approved. Chapter 19. The Fire Point. It was not difficult for Haille to excuse himself, as he was not engaged in conversation like the others. He imagined his companions did not even make note of his departure, except for Adamantus, whose large eyes followed him from across the room as he stepped around a cluster of laughing elves and slipped out through the stone archway they had entered through earlier in the evening. His eyes still not fully adjusted to the dark of the night woods, he stumbled once off the paved path. He spread his arms out, feeling for the trunks to his left and right until he had some idea of the space. Then he saw her. He had no doubt that she wanted to be seen. Otherwise, with her soft footfalls and liquid movements, she easily could have disappeared into the night. He opened his mouth to greet her, but he stubbed his toe on a root and nearly fell over instead. She smiled. But as she did so, the bandage on her face crinkled and her smile faded like a child's chalk drawing washed away by rain. She seemed to recede back into the shadow before speaking. "You watched me today, at the ceremony," she said. "I did," he said, deciding there was no use in lying. "And you spent the day playing with Sandalin and Mayleaf's elflings, and sleeping in the sun. Seems I was followed as well." "You were, but you did not come out." She was quiet a while, brooding. "No." Haille expected an explanation. He did not get one, but then again the bandage was explanation enough. She turned to walk away. He was afraid he had offended her, and was vexed at why. Girls were so difficult to understand, perhaps even more so if they were elves, he thought. To his relief, she turned. "Come on, follow me." He did so. Haille felt like a kitten following a string. She moved through the passages among the trees without a sound. Occasionally they passed through an empty plaza, lit by the same torches giving off silver-blue light. But as they neared, the torches would fade, only to light again once they had moved beyond them. As a result, they moved in a shell of darkness. He had no doubt that it somehow was Veolin's work. He stumbled a few times, which were the only times she would look back, allowing him to see her face. The rest of the time she was turned away, making her hard to see, her black garments topped with locks of black hair melting seamlessly into the dark. There was no denying the fact that he could not keep up. At times he followed in the light of the relit torches, only guessing where she was in the darkness ahead. Finally she stopped and waited under a smoldering lantern. Haille came up panting. A small door waited, carved into the bole of the tree before her. Veolin stooped under the lantern, reached to her face, and drew the bandage away, watching him closely for his reaction. The wound was awful, the skin torn in 3 gashes, the tendons of her face beneath exposed. Was that bone he could see through the cleaved muscle? Whatever it was, her cheek was ruined. He felt a twinge of discomfort, a shivering from his throat down to his toes, accompanied by a guilty sense of voyeurism. Veolin's own expression was inscrutable, reproachful, challenging. The light, the way her facial muscles had been destroyed, made it impossible to tell. She finally turned her eyes back to the doorway. Stuffing the bandage away and leaving her wound open to the air, she said, "This is the way," then pushed in through the door. Her voice was strange, more certain now, as if she had stripped away a certain inhibition when she had drawn away the bandage. They went up twisting corridors, bored right into the columns of the tree. As they rose up and up, passing by holes and windows, Haille felt gusts of cool air and heard the sounds of the nighttime forest. In a few places, the tunnel branched off into 2 directions. Veolin slowed there, letting him catch up before she continued on. These are the tunnels I used to run through as a child to escape from my brothers and their friends. They were always picking on me as an elfling. Until you were old enough to fight back. Until I was old enough to beat them. As they rose higher, the tunnel grew steeper so that Haille couldn't help but crawl. He guessed that it would have taken a brave elfling to climb so high at a young age. The passage grew airier as the walls became a latticework of interlocking branches. Soon they were crawling up stairs made of the very branches themselves, branches as thick as a leg, as thick as forearms, then just as thick as fingers. Haille looked left and right. Beyond the immediate branches were stars that hung like fruit of the trees between the boughs. As the branches continued to thin, the leaves became busier with the growing breeze, and then it was all gone. The sky opened up all around him with a wind that was like a gasp. Stars as numerous as the sand upon the beach tumbled over each other in the sky, all the way to the edge of night on the horizon. All around them were the endless undulating treetops that swayed like ocean waves and made a sound like rain falling. It was a sound he realized he had been hearing all day, except from far below. The top of the tree had been flattened to grow into a platform. Veolin walked along it a few feet ahead of him, her body bouncing as if on a wire. Haille reached down to feel what darkness they were walking upon. It was a solid interweaving of branches. He probed it for holes, and any he found were no deeper than half a finger. He took a few unsure steps. The floor was springy, giving slightly. Veolin stood just at the edge, the leaves of the forest whispering below her. He came up alongside, testing his weight. She took no notice of him, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw that they were remote. He chose to respect her silence and looked away. The stars were of all colors, red, blue, gold. He never would have believed they could possess so many different hues. It was like looking on stars with whole new personalities, completely different from the cold ice faces he had gazed upon from his chamber window. These were hot and varied like jewels. The ones on the edge of the horizon wavered and shimmered like insistent embers, smoldering in the thicker, lower air of the earth. "They call this place the Fire Point," Veolin said, her eyes still engaged in the sky. "When I was young, I imagined it was named so because here the stars look as if they are on fire." "They do. So is that the reason?" She shrugged. "Most likely it was because this place was used to signal another tower like it, farther in the woods with firelight. But my father never told me that. He let me go on believing it was named after what I imagined." She paused and looked to Haille as if to measure his response before she continued. "He was that sort of man who would gladly indulge imagination, to revel in it, than to bother about fact. Facts are for humans, he used to say. Gawain Alistair, that was his name. He was a human. Human. Hence my name, Crossborn. Father was extraordinary. Caring, gentle, giving, but also dangerous. We knew he was a great fighter, but we knew not why or from where he had learned his skills. He seemed loath to teach us such arts, but as Vorgs moved closer to our lands, we began to glimpse his knowledge. It was prodigious. He taught us all how to defend ourselves, even though it was against his wishes that we should live in a world where we had to. He was a man in love with the beauty of the world, not violence." She stared downward, her chin nearly on her breast, then looked up again into the stars, a smile now on her lips. "Once, upon finding bumblebees burrowing into a bench in our house, instead of dropping oil into the holes to kill them, he disassembled the bench and mounted it in glass on our wall so we could watch the bees' progress as they laid eggs, grew larvae, and created a nest. I remember him holding me up on his shoulders to watch. It is no wonder my mother was willing to marry outside her kind for him." "I did not know my mother." Haille said, looking down and tapping at the branches idly with his foot. Her hand moved to his elbow, anticipating that he was going to step forward towards the edge. He was not, but he stepped back anyway, and felt disappointed as she removed her hand and its pressure. "My father is all I have left," he continued, "which is why I want to tear through these woods to reach him." She was staring directly into his face, and he felt somewhat conspicuous. She pointed to the horizon. "That is south, where Kerith lies. There he waits." Haille turned. He had lost any sense of direction climbing up the tree. All the views from the top looked the same to him, but now this horizon seemed different, simply from the knowledge that under those smoldering stars was a camp where his father lay asleep. The anxiety from earlier returned, but this time he found his words flowing, his thoughts open. "And yet, I don't even know how he will receive me." "What do you mean?" Veolin said, turning her face to him. His gaze fell to her wound. I suffer the shaking sickness. I don't know if you elves are afflicted with it, but I fall into seizures unexpectedly. In my father's eyes, I'm weak, of body, of character. I'm broken. He was ready to send me away before I ran away." "You ran away?" "To find a cure, but I gave it to Katlyn instead, to save her from a fatal wound." Veolin said nothing, instead taking a deep breath. For a while they both watched the leaves twist in the breeze at their feet. "Then she is indebted to you." "We are friends. Even though I have not always been a good one, she would do the same for me." "I see." She was quiet for another long pause before she cleared her throat. "You will leave tomorrow, with or without the elders' approval." "How is that?" "I will lead you through the woods, whether they agree to it or not." "Why would you do that for me? You hardly know me." She turned to him, a flash of anger in her eyes. He pressed forward nonetheless. "I could be no different from the other conquerors descended of Haille Hillbourne. What about the repercussions, the reprisals your own people would take upon you?" "They matter nothing to me. And don't insult me by inferring that I could not deal with my people and their disapproval. I have faced it my whole life, being a crossborn," she said, her tone firm. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to offend. I just wondered why you would grant me such kindness, being who I am." Now it was her face that turned away. He thought it was out of anger, and he regretted ruining the candor of the moment, but when she spoke, her voice was timid. "There is a question of what connects us now. You and your friends saved my life, but your ancestor betrayed my people. As a race we may be opposed, but as individuals, perhaps we are friends. I am at least in your debt, and obliged to fulfill it." "I would like to be friends." She nodded, turning to him, a glimmer in the corner of her eyelashes. "After all, you're not the only one that feels broken." She gestured to her wound, her fingers stopping short of touching it. "The other elves, they are happy I have been saved, do not doubt that, but they look at me differently, as if I am some terrible accident, a monster like the Vorgs, their poison in my very blood. I am a tragedy now, a sigh, a pause in the conversation when you shake your head and say, 'She was beautiful once, it is so sad,' then move on." Haille took a deep breath. He could feel the coldness of the air in his throat and lungs. Why did he want to reach out and take her hand in his so much just then? "I still think you are beautiful. The Vorgs can't change who you are." She wiped her eyes and shook her head. He could see her righting herself. The pain she had let him glimpse was being shielded again behind iron walls. He wondered if Val had felt the same sense of inadequacy when Haille had tried to push the captain away. How he wished he had the words Val did, to soothe her, to answer the questions raging in her mind. But his mouth froze. His thoughts stuck on the fact that he simply wanted to touch her, console her. His hands began to tremble. He made fists and looked away, thankful for the darkness to cover his awkwardness. Restraint was best, he told himself. Who was he to do such a thing as reach out and to make contact, to be so presumptuous? After all, she was an elf, and he was descended from a traitor who had betrayed her people. "We should go now," she said, her voice faint on the wind, her thoughts, he knew, somewhere else. The next morning, back in his room in Sandalin's home, Val roused him from his sleep with a none too gentle shake.
"Wake up, my prince. The elders have made their decision. They're going to send us off this day with guides and provisions."
"Guides? Who?" Val stopped in the doorway, looked back over his shoulder and smiled.
"Lazalorn and Kaleif." He paused. "And I think that sister of theirs, too."
Chapter 20. No Small Thing.
"The king is drunk, but he has asked for you,"
Derrid said, snapping the flap to the side and stepping into the tent. Gail lay on her cot, sore, stinking from a coating of sweat, blood, and dust. She had thought of disrobing, treating her wounds and washing her blood and the blood of others off her, but upon entering the coolness of the tent, the battle over, she had collapsed into a shallow sleep, only dimly aware of time passing. She was in a space where the washing and treating of wounds, mere movement, remained only distant thoughts. Already the horrors, the close calls of the battle, the intimate combat when mortality and suffering were laid so bare before her eyes, were intruding upon her mind as they would in nightmares for a lifetime. New ones to add to old. But at Derrid's entrance, she was forced back to the present moment. The aching of her wounds, the stench of her body, and the spinning of the room. Soot was perched next to her head, as if standing guard. She was so thirsty. She could not remember the last time she drank or ate. She lifted her head to look at her master. "Surely he would want to see me when he is feeling more dignified."
"Not likely,"
Derrid said, still in the mud and blood-stained armor he had worn to the fight, a cut above his eyes still untreated.
"We're all fresh from battle, a battle in which you saved us. Perhaps the king himself."
"Does he drink to celebrate?"
"He drinks while the healers tend to him. He was wounded."
She sat up. "Badly so?"
"A spear grazed his side, a wound that will call for cleaning and stitches. Likely he calls for you to distract himself from the pain."
"Then I best be going," she said, pushing herself up to her feet, soot flapping off to the corner with an angry squawk. Derrid moved to her side and offered his hand.
"Best you should."
She had been inside the king's tent before for meetings. Then she had been protected from scrutiny by sheer numbers. When she had met the king in Derrid's tent, she had just been a squire, no one worth paying attention to. But this time was different. This time the cavernous interior of the king's tent was dark and empty. The high-backed wooden chair of the king sat without an occupant, and without the company of the men of note that usually took knee around it. A ghostly white light from the moon cut in from a gap in the tent's canvas to fall on the seat, as if to highlight the air of abandonment. It would be impossible to hide from scrutiny this time. Derrid led them to a curtain in the rear of the tent. Bright candlelight flickered behind, casting shadows of moving figures against it. She could hear the sound of dripping water or wine, along with the soft murmur of attentive voices. Derrid announced themselves quite before she was ready, and the voice of King Talamar himself, rough with an edge of discomfort, answered back.
"Enter."
The space on the other side was filled with more figures than Gail had anticipated. Half a dozen healers and their accompanying apprentices tended to the king. Talamar himself was shirtless, and laying half prone on a camp bed, satin pillows propping him up. The pillows were stained with his blood, and the boiled wine the healers were cleaning his wound with. The wound was a gash that rent open the left side of his torso. It had been a thrust aimed to impale him through the gut, but with luck or good swordsmanship, it had been parried so that it only sliced the flesh beneath his ribs. On another less fit man, such a wound would have only opened up the yellow layers of fat most men carried in their middles. But the king was not a fat man. His upper body was molded with muscle and tapered down to a hard torso. The flesh of his wound was red with muscle and sinew, the healers digging into his flesh with heated pincers and forceps. Gail's stomach turned as she contemplated the pain. The king, but for a sheen of sweat on his brow, was stoic, aided more than a little by the wine that one of the apprentices kept pouring for him. His face was flush, but his eyes were surprisingly alert. No doubt the pain of the operation kept him from sliding into a drunken stupor. She had expected to be disappointed, even uncomfortable at the sight of the king so humble, so wounded, so mortal. But he maintained a sense of grandeur. He was a leader so different than her father, who ruled through threats and force. The king, by contrast, did so through building rapport and respect. She never would have thought such an approach could work until she had borne witness. It was a revelation that transcended her previous expectations. Derrid took a knee and she followed, casting her eyes to the floor. She had to remember she was a young and humble boy, not an experienced warrior or woman. She wondered, could a leader with nobility in his blood, a king, see through her disguise? Did he have such perception?
"So it is you,"
Talamar said, followed by a quick intake of breath as a healer pinched out a crumpled mail ring with tweezers.
"That we owe our lives to."
He took another sip of wine. It made him seem more human, and she was able to stutter, You are too generous, Your Majesty."
"Humility is fitting for brides and birthmaids, not after battle."
"This is the most important time, my liege," Gail said, "so that men do not lose sight of their mortality and the luck the fates may have visited upon them." Talamar examined her wordlessly for a while before saying,
"Well met. You've taught him well, Derrid."
He motioned for both of them to rise with his cup hand.
"I wish I could claim such influence,"
Derrid said, a proud smile on his face.
"But Alex is wise beyond his years." "That is clear,"
Talamar said, his words beginning to slur a bit from the pain or the strength of the wine.
"Where does one so young gain so much wisdom?"
She fell back to the lie that had served her well so far. "My father was a warrior before he was a farmer. He fought in the War of Islay." The king nodded, taking a deep, relieved breath as the healers withdrew, announcing that the wound was clean. One of the apprentices began to ready thread for stitching, while his master heated a needle using a candle flame.
"Did your father show the same proclivity for insubordination?"
the king asked. The word caused Gail to look up into the king's face, but he was smiling. "He always taught me the importance of thinking for myself. After all, few plans survive contact with the enemy." Her confidence was growing now. Talamar chuckled and reached his cup out for more wine.
"Careful, young squire, else I promote you to replace one of my captains," he said, taking another sip. "Who were your allies as you rallied the squires?"
"In truth, sire?"
"This is no time for anything other,"
David said. "Two friends who were loyal and, well, deception was an ally as well, for I knew the squires would not act unless I spoke falsely that you had ordered the reinforcements yourself."
"Bold,"
Talamar said. "I was willing to be so, sire, for I felt the need was great."
"You were so certain of a trap."
She picked her next words carefully. "It was in keeping with the Morvant's tactics so far." At this the king nodded, the corners of his mouth tugged downward.
"For this you will be lauded, but also resented, young man. Your insight, while averting calamity, exposed the deficiencies of my generals, and even me."
"I meant no such disrespect," she said, her armpits suddenly itching, hot and weeping. "I will be more than happy to share the responsibility with my master. I could say he left me with such instructions, casting me in a role of obedience, and the battle can his own.
Humility again,
the king said as the healers moved in with the needle and thread. He winced as they made the first puncture and drew the thread through the flap of skin.
Damn if the repairs don't smart more than the injury itself,
he said, his knuckles white around the cup, his voice overly loud.
Sadly, it is often the case, my liege,
Derrid said. Gail envied him for his comfort speaking to the king. She could sense her own limbs trembling. Perhaps the king could too, for his tone grew soft and laudatory again.
Rule and ranks aside, young Alexander, you've done a noble and good thing today. And if I do not show more gratitude, you may blame it on the pains of this repair. I am in your debt, young squire. That is no small thing. Although it might be prudent to share some of this glory with your master, as to save face for my generals, I will not forget to whom I owe my life.
She swallowed and managed to croak out, You are too generous, my liege, and dropped back to her knee.
I am alive, provided these healers do not kill me, and I am grateful.
The apprentices wore expressions of dismay, but the oldest of the healers, the man threading the king's wound, smiled and said,
If that spear thrust did not take you, Majesty, my needle hardly will.
Derrid, understanding some level of unspoken etiquette lost on Gail, asked,
Shall we take your leave, Majesty?
The king raised his cup, his arm wobbling a bit, the wine affecting him.
You are dismissed. Go with my blessings.
It was not until they had left the king's grand tent and had taken several paces in the direction of their own that Gail looked up to Derrid and said, I hope I represented you well, sir.
Quite well indeed. You are as honey-tongued as the offspring of a cantor and a diplomat.
I was nervous, more nervous facing him than the enemy.
As we both were, considering what secrets we conceal from him,
he said, his voice low.
But worry not. I'm fairly certain you have his favor, and like he said, that is no small thing.